I think one of the most important things to recognize before we get started is that we're all professionals on this job site. We share a responsibility to make sure that we understand what the issues are, that we come up with good, safe plans, and that we work together as a team to make sure that we eliminate problems wherever we possibly can. We're going to talk about a number of things in this presentation. First of all, a little bit about what your role is in the safety and security of not only yourself, but your coworkers and the overall project. Let's face it, every job that we work on is a critical project. There are always things that we need to deal with in terms of schedule, quality, and safety. So we're going to identify some of the basic safety information on the job, and then we're going to identify what the plan is, just in case there's any type of an emergency. I think it's important to note that as constructors, we have a responsibility to our project owners and to ourselves to make sure that we practice proper decorum. That includes appropriate clothing, making sure that our language is appropriate, and whatever behaviors that we have, whether it's horseplay or whatever, is eliminated as a problem. Pretty much every construction site has differing security requirements, whether they're our own or the owner's. So we're going to talk about the specific job site requirements a little bit later on with the project team. But some of the common things we need to be aware of are the potential for unlocked doors, strangers, any suspicious parcels that have been left behind. We have to be sure that we cooperate with any investigations. And another thing to note is that picture taking may be allowed, but it must be coordinated through BBE. And if somebody says no, don't. Many of you may know that more than 4,500 workers die every year in the workplace, and over 1,000 of those are in the construction industry. Annually, about 1.3 million workers miss workdays from injuries. And another important consideration is that employees with fewer than 5 years on the job have over 35% of the illnesses and injuries. So part of the lesson there is to pay attention to the new guys and girls. You may have noticed that already through this orientation, I've used the word important on pretty much every slide. And that's because it's important that we take every facet of safety on the job site, every hazard, every risk, and we talk about it. We identify it and we take corrective action. Because BB&E's goal is an incident-free workplace, and you play a key role. Part of what we hope that you will do is participate in all of our safety conversations, that you'll be part of the planning process, that you'll help us come up with solutions. In a way, you can help us as well by reporting any hazards that you see or any near misses or something that might have been close to an accident that we might be able to fix, or we may be able to come up with a better way. I think it's important, there's that word again, to ask for help. If you see something, say something. If you don't know, you don't go. If you're unsure about the operation, or if you feel unsafe in any way, stop doing what you're doing. Talk to your foreman, talk to your supervisor, talk to our superintendent, talk to me, but stop doing what you're doing and ask for help. Another consideration to think about is as we go through the process of implementing safety on the job site, Bartlett, Brainard, Eacott uses both a positive and negative reinforcement procedure to promote safety. What this means is that if things are going well, we may buy you lunch. If things aren't going well, we may write safety infraction notices on the job. Nobody wants to go that route. So let's keep it positive, let's work together, and let's make sure that we keep this job site as safe as we possibly can. There are a number of ways that you can find safety information on this job. Obviously, it starts with this orientation, but there's also job-specific safety information that should come from your employer as well. Toolbox talks, job hazard analyses, any type of incident reporting, inspection data, all of that is kept both with your foreman and with us in the trailer or in the job office. We have a number of bulletin boards throughout the site. We'll let you know about changing conditions, and you can always talk to either our project superintendent or myself, and again, communicate directly with your foreman or your safety personnel as well to make sure that your company understands what the issues may be on the job. Let's run quickly through some general safety rules. Obviously, it's critical that you obey all warning signs, postings, barricades, etc. It's also critical that you follow all designated safety procedures, whether it's from the training that you've received, your company programs and procedures, or our requirements. Drug and alcohol use are prohibited on-site and off-site during work hours, and we appreciate your cooperation on this one. Bartlett, Brainard, Eacott projects are entirely tobacco-free. This includes not only cigars and cigarettes, but e-cigarettes, vapes, chew, anything like that. Again, thinking about some of the general safety rules, and this is just common sense stuff. Think before you act. Be aware of the safety not only of yourself, but of others. Be aware of your surroundings. Who are you working alongside? What hazards are you creating for others? Pay attention to, listen for backup alarms, alarms on lifts, or any other warnings that you may hear. Don't take shortcuts. Understand what your process is supposed to be and follow it. And be aware of changing conditions on the job site, whether it's lighting inside or mud on the outside. Be aware of what can happen and what can create risk on the job. We've all heard this one. Don't engage in horseplay. That's one way that people can get hurt. There should be no weapons on site. And another thing to think about is no radios or any music devices, including earbuds from your phone, are allowed on site. These can be a tremendous distraction. If you must use a cell phone on site, it should be for work purposes only. If you have to take a call, we ask that you never do it while you're at height. If you're on a ladder, a scaffold, a lift, etc., let them leave a message, call them back, or come down from where you are at height so that you can speak safely. There should be no working in live panels. We're never going to work hot on electricity. Our jobs require 100% safety glasses and hard hats, plus other PPE depending on what you're doing. When it comes to extension cords, we will provide GFCI outlets with our temporary power, but you must also use a GFCI pigtail whenever you're using an extension cord. Here's another thing that a lot of people don't think about. On many of our projects, many job sites in general, there may be hazardous materials, whether it's asbestos, lead, PCBs, etc. Depending on where you're working, who the owner is, what types of exposures there are, the key thing is that you don't disturb any of these materials. You have to start by being able to recognize them, and if you don't know, speak with your supervisor. If you're working around ACM or asbestos-containing materials, you must have Class 4 training before you work around that ACM. Whenever these materials are found in potential work areas, we may need to have them abated before you can start work. So again, ask questions. With the years of experience that you have and the extensive training that you've received over the years, I think it's pretty easy for you to identify many safety hazards throughout the workplace. We ask that if you see something, stop, fix it if you can. If you can't fix it, report it. And always, please feel free to suggest ideas for safety improvement. We will take action on your ideas. Good housekeeping can be a key indication of safety on a job site. If it looks good, it probably is, because it really shows attention to detail on the job. It's important that we keep clear access to evacuation routes, emergency exits, firefighting equipment, first aid stations, and electrical panels. All walkways and aisles should be kept clear for safe passage. If there are obstructions like drawers or doors that, again, inhibit progress, please make sure that they're closed or secured. And here's something that I'm a stickler on. If you are generating trash on the job site, whether it's work-related trash or break-related trash, please dispose of it promptly and properly. Clean up after yourself, especially after break, after lunch, etc. And when you walk onto the job site with that cup of coffee, make sure you find a trash receptacle before you drop it on the floor. I will thank you for that personally. Something that I've found to be extremely successful over the years is a process called nothing hits the floor. The idea is to keep materials mobile and to help get them into a proper lifting zone. I think it's important that we store materials on racks, carts, or pallets that can be easily moved either for cleaning or access and egress or material loading, etc. When you have a fabrication area or a cutting location, make sure that there's a waste receptacle, whether it's a can or a buggy, immediately adjacent to your work area so the scraps go in the trash rather than on the floor. And another important thing, you've all heard about this, we need to keep leads, hoses, extension cords, etc. elevated wherever we possibly can. Ergonomics is a term that many of us have heard. Basically, what it means is make the work fit the body or the body fit the work. We need to be aware of the body positions that we're in while we're doing our work, while we're moving materials on the job, while we're carrying things up and down stairs. Basically, what we need to think about is if it's heavy, goofy looking, long, we need to turn corners with it, we need to get it up into a high space. All of those can create additional stress and strain on the body. So ask for help. What this means by using a neutral position, that means that you keep the load as close to your body as you possibly can. Keep your shoulders back and your back straight as you carry materials around the job site. If you're working off of ladders, there are two things to be considered. One is the potential fall issue, but the other is the stress and strain that your body undergoes because you're trying to keep yourself on the ladder and you're also trying to stretch and do your work. So that can cause additional problems. Now, when it says take breaks, it doesn't mean take a 15-minute break every hour. What it means is if you get into an uncomfortable position or if you're doing a repetitive task, stop for a few seconds and stretch it out. Stretch in the opposite direction that you've been leaning or putting your arms up in the air. It's a great idea before you start work to do stretches and any kind of exercises that get your muscles warmed up. There are many companies across the country that require this pre-task. We don't do that, but it's a great idea. And I know this sounds funny because we're all construction workers and we work our butts off throughout the course of the day. But keeping fit, whether it's watching your food intake, if it's exercise, if it's walking, etc., anything that we can do outside the workplace to keep us fit is only going to keep us safer on the job site. Now here's the don't side of ergonomics. It says don't use awkward positions, and I know that many times we get into those awkward positions and we don't have a choice. The key is to try to think about your work, try to plan in advance to minimize the amount of time that you spend in some position underneath or between or around objects that you've got to put your body in a weird position. Don't use the wrong tools for the tasks. Using a spud wrench where you need to have a box wrench isn't a good idea and you're likely to get hurt. I know that we're always in positions where we need to reach and stretch for things, but the goal is to keep them stored properly so we can, again, minimize the likelihood of having to reach and stretch. Use a different lift, use a different ladder. Keep the materials between your shoulders and your knees wherever you possibly can. Back injuries are one of the most common types of injuries on a construction site, and they can take a long time to heal. So it's important that you pay attention not only to the soft tissues that we talked about with ergonomics, but also specifically to your back. First thing is try to assess what the load is that you have to pick up. Can you physically carry it? Do you need to ask for help? And then before you pick up this load and carry it from point A to point B, walk down the route. Make sure there are no tripping hazards. Make sure there are no obstructions, because if you trip and fall while you're carrying something, you're more likely to hurt your back. And we've all heard most of these. Lifting safely means bending at your knees, keeping the load as close to your body as you possibly can. Make sure you face the load. Don't twist your body while you're carrying something. And let your legs do most of the lifting by standing with your back straight. Now I know, again, some of this stuff is not easy to do given the type of work that we do. So again, it's about minimizing the time spent in these awkward positions. Another thing to think about is not overextending when you're reaching. If you have to, move your ladder, move your lift so that you're not reaching out and over with a weight that could put, again, additional strain on your back. When you're moving materials on the site, whether it's manually or using powered equipment, it's important to understand what the load is, how much it weighs, and where you have to go with it. Make sure that you've got the right equipment, whether it's a hand truck or a pallet jack. If the floors are uneven, you want to use a hand truck. If they're flat and solid, you can use a pallet jack. Understand whether and how a forklift can be used. If you've got conveyors, understanding how they work, making sure that they don't have any parts that you could get your fingers or arms caught in. And it's really critical to understand how a crane works, keep away from it where you possibly can, make sure that it's rigged and set up properly. When you're loading equipment onto either a truck or a cart, make sure that you load it properly, keep the center of gravity within the wheels so that you don't tip the thing over. And when you're moving things by hand, always push the load wherever possible. Don't pull it because, again, you're more likely to hurt your back. Personal protective equipment is another key component of safety on a job site. Required PPE for Bartlett, Brainard, Eacott jobs is at least safety glasses and hard hats. It's critical that you make sure that your PPE fits properly, that you've inspected it to make sure that it's in good shape, and that you store it properly as well. While we require hard hats and safety glasses at all times, we always recommend gloves wherever possible. Sometimes they can create a greater hazard, but hand injuries are one of the most common types of injuries on any job site. Because of the potential for overlapping shifts, if you're entering and leaving the job site and there's another crew working while you're walking through, you need to make sure that you keep that PPE on. And you'll note that this individual has high visibility safety gear. Our requirement is that whenever you're working outside the building, around traffic, around heavy equipment, around lifts, etc., you've got high visibility Class 2 reflective gear. Here's a reminder for a really common issue. Whenever you're doing cutting or grinding where the materials may fly off the wheel or the wheel may break apart, not only do you have to wear safety glasses, but you've also got to have a face shield. I don't know about you, but electricity scares me. You can't see it, but it can kill you. So some of what we require and what OSHA requires is making sure that we're using the proper equipment for the job. 12 gauge cords, no residential power strips like you might plug your computer into, using the appropriate plugs for the outlet, making sure that you inspect your cords and tools on a daily and shiftly basis to make sure that it's in good shape. Make sure that all electrical connections are tight. Keep flammables away from outlets. Make sure that we have clear access to anywhere that we have to access electricity, whether it's plugging into the outlets or working around an open panel. Make sure that we're using GFCIs at the source and protect cords from damage. One of the key things is if we have cords in a hallway, keep them off to the side. If they're crossing the hallway for some reason, don't drive lifts over them. We've already talked about the size of the cords that we're using and the power strips that you've used at home. Make sure that you don't fasten cords with anything that's conductive, whether it's wire, staples, nails, etc. Keep cords out of the water. Don't touch cords with wet hands if they're still plugged in. Don't use damaged cords. Make sure that you inspect your cords. If it's missing a ground prong, don't use it. And never use 3-prong adapters to get from 3 prongs to a 2-prong on an older building. Lockout tagout is a really important component of a safety program, especially in an existing building. And it's not just about electrical systems. It's about anything with stored energy in it. Plumbing, HVAC, steam, fire alarms, sprinklers, anything that we could come in contact with that's live that we could have some type of an issue with. Understanding lockout tagout requirements is something you really need to talk to your supervisor about to understand what your company policies are. And we also have our own requirements, and many times the owner has requirements beyond both of ours. So we have to be sure to coordinate. When it comes to lockout tagout, again, communication and coordination is key to success. At a minimum, anytime we need to shut down a system, we have to communicate that to the building owner, the facilities manager, etc., at least 5 days in advance. And anytime we're working in an area that might affect data centers or data management, we have to be ready to speak to the owner 60 days in advance. Now, it may be a coordination process that takes a little bit of time, but we have to make sure that they're aware of these operations that may affect their operations. We talked early in the program about the 1,000 construction workers who lose their lives every single year. It's important to recognize that 35 to 40%, 350 to 400 of those individuals had some type of a fall exposure. They fell off of a ladder, they fell off of a building, or they fell off of a roof. That is by far the largest percentage. So fall protection is a huge issue for every single trade on the job site. We have to plan the work. We have to execute the plan. We have to replan if things change. Remember that it's important to prevent the fall wherever possible. Guardrails and hole covers are one of the most effective methods. If you use a harness and a lanyard, that stops the fall, but you've already fallen. Any exposure on a Bartlett Brainard Eacott job that's over 6 feet has to be protected, again, with guardrails, covers, personal fall arrest systems, etc. Every type of fall protection equipment should be inspected daily. Make sure that your supervisor knows where, when, and how you're tying off. That supervisor should be a competent person. He or she should understand how the equipment works, how it needs to be inspected, when and where, and how it's going to be taken out of service. If you ever have questions regarding fall protection, ask Bartlett Brainard Eacott personnel. We'll get you the help that you need. Now here's something to think about. When you tie off, whatever you anchor to has to be capable of supporting 5,000 pounds. That's a pickup truck. So make sure whatever you tie off to is significant. Excavation and trenching work can become dangerous very quickly. It's important to have a competent person on site who's familiar with the excavation and trenching regulations to ensure that everything goes safely on site. We consider all soils on site to be Type C. That means they need to be treated with the utmost care in accordance with OSHA regulations. Any excavation deeper than 5 feet has to be protected, but some conditions, including water or sand, may require protection at shallower depths. Proper access into and out of trenches and excavations has to be provided. And it's important to limit overhead exposures putting materials or equipment into trenches and excavations. Every one of these work areas has to be inspected daily, and anytime that you see something out of the ordinary or something that you consider to be unsafe, make sure you communicate with your supervisor. Stepladders may be one of the most common tools on any job site. Pretty much every trade uses them. And that's why there's such a high frequency of injuries and accidents associated with ladders. It's important to remember that you can't step on the top 2 rungs where the label says don't. It's important that you not lean stepladders against the wall. Make sure that you don't walk the ladder, moving legs side to side, trying to ooch yourself up a few inches or more. Make sure that the ladder is fully inspected, and it's important to note that every single label that came with the ladder has to still be there, and it has to be legible. If it's worn off, rubbed off, scratched off, the ladder needs to be taken out of service until the labels are replaced. Make sure that you lock the spreaders before you use the ladder. Stand on the steps only, don't stand on the back side. Make sure that you understand what the capacity is of the ladder. It could be a 250-pound ladder, a 300-pound ladder. understand what your weight is and what the weight of the tools and equipment is that you have to use. And don't climb a ladder with tools in your hands. Now here's something a lot of people don't think about. If you're working on a ladder in close proximity to an edge or an open window or a guardrail, it's possible that if your ladder were to fall over, you could actually fall over that guardrail or through that window opening. So our requirement is that if your ladder is within 1.5 times the height of the ladder, for example, an 8-foot ladder within 12 feet of a guardrail, you have to tie off or seek some other means of access. Now this can be a little confusing at times, so if you have any questions, talk to your supervisor. Extension ladders are a little bit different from step ladders. Primary difference being is that it's a system of parts, and all of those parts have to stay together. It's important when you use an extension ladder that you don't separate the sections, that you make sure that the top and bottom are secured so it can't slide sideways or out from the bottom. Make sure that you've got a clear landing surface at the top and the bottom. It should be about 36 inches square without any tripping hazards. Scaffolding comes in all shapes and sizes. Some of the key considerations are that when it's put together, it has to be put together under the guidance of a competent person. And every shift it has to be inspected and approved for use. Once it's approved for use, it should have a green tag on it so that everybody knows that it's safe to use. When you build a scaffold, regardless of where you build it, you have to ensure that you have proper supporting surfaces, whether it's hard concrete or mud sills underneath the legs. Anytime you have a fall exposure over 6 feet, you need to have guardrails. In some cases, you may have to have outriggers to prevent a top-heavy scaffold from tipping over. Every time you use a mobile scaffold, at least 2 of the wheels need to be locked before you get down or get onto a scaffold. You should never surf a scaffold. And for safe access, it's a good idea to have a swing gate onto the platform so that you don't have to climb through the guardrails to get onto the platform. Boom lifts, scissor lifts, and forklifts have some very specific operating requirements. Perhaps the first thing that you need to have is a training certificate. You need to be trained how to use this equipment. Before you use it, number one, you should inspect the equipment to make sure that it's operating properly, that there are no leaks, no broken hoses, etc. But you also have to inspect the working area to make sure that it will be capable of supporting the load. Whenever you're working in a boom lift, it's important that you use a retractable lanyard, not a straight lanyard, for tie-off. When you are operating any one of these types of lifts, understand what the capacity of the lift is. You should never hoist a load with a boom lift or a scissor lift unless it's approved by the manufacturer. Read the directions. Anytime one of these machines go into alarm, stop doing what you're doing. Figure out what the problem is, and typically you're going to have to come down to resolve what the issue is. Crane planning is very important on Bartlett, Brainard, Eacott jobs. We expect a comprehensive plan to be submitted at least 2 weeks prior to the hoist date, although that time frame may increase given the complexity of any specific lift. It's important that you understand all of the operational requirements for a crane and that the appropriate documentation be provided with your plan. All operators have to be licensed, and riggers and signalers have to be trained with a certificate. Prior to rigging, you should inspect all your gear. If there's any damage, remove it from service, and be sure that all of the tags are legible so that you can understand what the capacity of any given piece is. Make sure, this is perhaps one of the most important things, never stand under a load. Whenever you use hazardous chemicals on a job, you have the right to understand what the hazards are and what the appropriate protective measures should be. All of that information can be found on the safety data sheet, a copy of which your employer should keep close by their side, and a copy of which will be provided to BB&E to maintain in our trailer. When you have to use hazardous chemicals to perform your work, it's important that you plan ahead. Perhaps one thing that you should assume is that there will be a spill and that you be prepared to clean it up as soon as possible. Anytime there is a spill, you should report it to your supervisor and to Bartlett, Brainard, Eacott. If you're performing any operation that might generate dust, mists, or fumes, speak to your supervisor to make sure that there is an appropriate JHA specific to that work. It's very critical that we have a plan for silica exposures, paints and solvents, and especially carbon monoxide, because each one of these three materials could affect others in the workplace. Make sure that the JHA talks about the specific location that these materials might be generated in, how those materials might be reduced through the course of engineering controls, and how you're going to monitor the materials to make sure that they don't reach excessive levels. Barricades are an important component of any safety program. It's important that you understand what the barricades mean and how to treat them. When it comes to a yellow barricade, you might be able to cross as long as you proceed with caution. Keep an eye out. But anytime there's red tape, you should not cross that barricade until you've received specific permission from the person who put that tape up. Anytime you have to remove tape or barricades to perform your work, make sure that you replace it exactly as it was found. And critically, if you don't have to cross a barricade, simply don't. A fire on a job site can be catastrophic. Make sure that you practice proper housekeeping techniques and that you remove combustibles from the work area as soon as you possibly can. Pay attention to electrical wires and equipment. Make sure that circuits aren't overloaded, there are no frayed wires or cords, and don't run over extension cords. Be aware of storage requirements for the chemicals that you may be using, because some are incompatible when stored next to each other. An additional way to help prevent fires is to understand where hot work will be generated. We have a very specific permit process that you have to go through to plan hot work on the job. Anytime your operations will create heat, spark, or flame, speak to your supervisor and get a permit from Bartlett, Brainard, Eacott. Again, perhaps one of the most important considerations here is that you have to have a fire watch, and that must remain in place for 60 minutes after the hot work is complete, or perhaps longer if the owner requires a longer period of time. If there is a fire on site, it's a 4-step process. Stop what you're doing, remove people from the danger area, activate the alarm, call 911, speak to your supervisor, or call BBE. Contain the fire. Try to close doors and windows so that it can't spread throughout the rest of the job site. And note that the last thing that you want to do is try to fight the fire. Know and understand how to use an extinguisher, but that's the last thing you should be doing. Get out safely. That's the most important thing. You should familiarize yourself with the location of extinguishers that can be found throughout the job. If you have to use one, pull the pin, aim the hose at the base of the fire, squeeze the trigger, and sweep the hose back and forth across the base of the fire. Continue as necessary. If there is an accident or an incident on site, inform your supervisor as quickly as you can. If it's life-threatening, dial 911. Be aware of other emergency numbers that are posted in the BBE field office. If you're trained, provide emergency first aid. Report the incident, and then cooperate with the investigation. Please do not leave the job site until you are released from that investigation. Providing emergency response can be challenging. The first rule is that you don't put yourselves in danger. If you're properly trained, be sure to follow the training to provide first aid and CPR. Call for 911 immediately, and be sure that nobody else can get into the area and be exposed to that particular hazard. In some cases, the job site may need to be evacuated. You will be provided with the appropriate instructions and muster points throughout the course of this orientation, and there will be postings on site. Please be sure to follow them and remain on site until the all clear is given. Again, it's critically important that you do not leave the site or go to your cars until you've been counted at the muster point and have been released by your supervisor. Some key points to remember regarding safety on this and every job site. Remember that you play a key role in keeping the job safe. We expect you to look for hazards throughout the job, report anything that you see, and obviously use common sense. You should be able to respond safely to emergencies. Again, never put yourself at risk. Always follow your own company's safety procedures, know and follow our requirements, and be sure that you always follow OSHA requirements. But remember that they are a minimum standard. And as always, if you don't know, ask. Every job site has specific requirements. Ours will be posted in the BB&E office. You should also be aware that when we are working under owner requirements and working within their systems, we will need to provide written methods of procedure and change control approval before we begin any work on their facilities. Now our project team is going to take a few minutes to address site-specific requirements, perhaps most importantly, what the owner expects of us and how we should behave professionally throughout the job site. One of the concepts that we employ on our job sites is called stop, think, prevent. If you find yourself in a situation that you think may be unsafe, please stop doing what you're doing. If you don't know how to address the issue, ask for help to figure it out. Think about all of the training that you've received. Think about all of the rules that apply, including physics and gravity. Help us, work together with us to prevent incidents, injuries, in the worst case, along with preventing damage to equipment, materials, or the environment. Sometimes, really, all it takes is another minute or two to come up with a better and safer way to do the work. One of the things that you can use for motivation throughout the day is to think about who it is that you're going home to at the end of that day and how important you are to them. Because one injury, one incident, one broken bone is too many. Thank you.